Hey, son. It is a Tuesday evening somewhere in America. The kitchen smells like something warm and slightly chemical, in the best possible way. The aluminum tray is sitting on the counter. The oven is ticking toward done. And somewhere between the TV guide and a rerun of Bonanza, dinner is about to happen. Tonight we are cracking open something that was once sealed, labeled, and slid into an oven at 350 degrees. The forgotten TV dinners of the 1960s. These were not just meals. They were a whole philosophy, a whole promise, a whole era of aluminum trays and compartmentalized ambition that said quietly but firmly, the future is now, and it tastes like Salisbury steak. This one is for the people who remember peeling back that foil corner just enough to let the steam out, and then burning your fingers anyway because patience was never really part of the deal. It is for the people who grew up eating their peas in one little square and their mashed potatoes in another, and who somehow still turned out just fine. And it is for everyone who has ever stood in a modern grocery store staring at a $10 organic grain bowl in a bamboo container and thought, something is missing. If this is your kind of evening, do us a quiet favor and hit like and subscribe. It costs you nothing, and it means everything over here. And if you have been listening on the go, we are now on Spotify. The link is down in the description. Come find us there. But first, let us ask the questions that actually matter. What did dinner taste like in 1963 when the whole country was eating off the same aluminum tray? Did your mother actually enjoy not cooking, or was she just being polite about it? Was the corn always slightly undercooked, or was that just the particular tragedy of your household? What happened to the brownie that used to live in the corner of the tray, and who decided we no longer deserved it? If Swanson could put an entire Thanksgiving dinner in a box in 1954, why does your own kitchen still feel like such an impossible project on a Wednesday night? And did anybody ever, in the entire decade of the 1960s, actually eat the pot pie without burning the roof of their mouth on the first bite? It is 1962 now. The oven hums. The living room flickers blue from the television set. Somewhere down the street, a dog is barking at nothing in particular. The aluminum tray is warming. Everything is about to make a very specific kind of sense. Let us start at the beginning, because the beginning is genuinely strange. The TV dinner did not begin because someone had a brilliant idea about the future of food. It began because Swanson had too many turkeys. In 1953, the company found itself sitting on 260 tons of leftover Thanksgiving turkey after a miscalculation in production. Someone, legend has it, a salesman named Jerry Thomas, looked at an aluminum tray used by airline meals and thought, this. Whether the story is entirely true has been debated for decades, but what nobody debates is what happened next. Swanson packaged that turkey with cornbread dressing, sweet potatoes, and peas into a segmented aluminum tray, slapped a price of 98 cents on it, and called it a TV brand frozen dinner. The name was on purpose. Television was the shiniest new thing in the American home, and Swanson wanted to be in the same sentence. The first year, Swanson sold around 5,000 units. They had expected to sell maybe a few hundred. They had not expected what actually happened, which was that American households looked at this aluminum tray and felt something. Not just convenience, something more like recognition. Like this was a thing they had been waiting for without knowing they were waiting for it. Think about what 1953 looked like on a Tuesday evening. The war was recent enough to still live in people's bodies. Women who had spent years working outside the home were being told firmly and from many directions that the home was where they belonged now. The refrigerator was new, the washing machine was new, the television set was new, And all of these things were supposed to be making life easier and more modern. The TV dinner fit that story perfectly. It was modern. It was efficient. It required almost nothing and delivered something warm and complete in 25 minutes. What Swanson understood, whether they understood it consciously or just felt it in the sales numbers, was that convenience is not really about laziness. It is about time. And time in the 1950s American household was not equally distributed. Someone was doing the cooking every night, and that someone was usually not eating first, and that someone was also doing the dishes after, and the TV dinner was a way of giving some of that time back. Even one night a week. Even one Tuesday. The airline meal connection is worth pausing on, because it tells you something about how the tray was designed. Airline meals in the early 1950s were meant to be eaten in a small space, in a moving vehicle, without making a mess, by people who did not want to think too hard about what they were doing. They were organized, contained, and engineered for the minimum possible friction. The TV dinner borrowed all of that logic and brought it into the living room. The tray table was the airplane tray. The television was the window seat. The whole arrangement made a kind of geometric sense. By 1960, Swanson was selling more than 70 million TV dinners a year. The turkey had given way to fried chicken and Salisbury steak and fish, and a roster of options that kept expanding like the country itself was expanding, outward and outward, suburb by suburb, freezer by freezer. The original idea, born from a surplus of turkey and a surplus of ambition, had become something nobody could have predicted from the inside of a refrigerated rail car full of unsold birds. That is how most important things begin. Not with a plan, but with too much of something, and someone willing to think sideways about what to do with it. It is Sunday evening now, and something has quietly shifted in the American home. The dining room table, that heavy piece of furniture that once organized the entire week, is sitting empty. Or it is holding a stack of newspapers and someone's unfinished hobby project. Because the family has migrated. They are in the living room in front of the television set, and there are folding tray tables set up in a row like little individual dining rooms for one. The TV dinner did not cause this migration exactly, but it rode it perfectly. The aluminum tray fit the tray table like they were designed for each other. Dinner now had a direction, and that direction was the screen. The tray table itself deserves some credit. It was a piece of furniture that knew exactly what it was and did not pretend otherwise. It folded flat. It stored behind the couch or inside a cabinet in a set of 4, nested together in a little rack. It came out when it was needed and disappeared when it was not. This was not the dining room table's philosophy. The dining room table was permanent and formal and implied a kind of commitment to sitting down together and being present with each other in a deliberate way. The tray table implied nothing except that you needed a surface, and here was one. In the 1950s and 60s, the television set was not yet something you could ignore. It was still new enough that watching it felt like an event. The family gathered in the living room the way an earlier generation might have gathered around a radio, with attention, with a sense that something was happening and you were part of it. Bringing dinner into that room was not disrespectful of the meal. It was just honest about where everyone wanted to be. Your mother understood this. She may have insisted on the dining room table for most nights of the week, and rightly so, because there is something that happens around a table that does not happen in front of a screen. Something about looking at each other and passing things and arguing about small things that do not matter. But on the nights when the tray tables came out, there was a different kind of warmth in the room, a permission. Everyone was pointed in the same direction, watching the same thing, laughing at the same moment, and the aluminum tray in your lap was part of that. The folding tray table became such a fixture of the 1960s living room that department stores sold them in matching sets with coordinated patterns, florals, geometric shapes, wood-grain finishes. You could have a set that matched your decor, which meant the tray table had crossed over from utility into something approaching interior design, which is how you know an object has truly arrived. What the tray table and the TV dinner together produced was a new kind of family meal. Less formal, more parallel. Everyone eating the same thing from individual trays, watching the same show, sharing the same evening without necessarily sharing words. This sounds like it might be lonely, described in the wrong tone of voice. But it was not lonely. It was easy. It was comfortable in the way that a room full of people who know each other well enough to be quiet together is comfortable. There is a kind of intimacy in that. It is the kind of quiet that is harder to find now, when every screen in the room is different and everyone is watching something the others cannot see. The living room in 1962, with its 4 tray tables and its 4 aluminum trays and its 1 shared television, was a room doing exactly what it was supposed to do. The first Swanson TV dinners were not complicated, and that was the whole point of them. Turkey was the original. Then came fried chicken, which arrived in 1955 and immediately became something people felt strongly about. Then Salisbury steak, which occupied a curious middle ground between hamburger and ambition. Then fish, which sold considerably less well, and seemed to understand why. The compartments were divided with military precision. The protein got the large section. The vegetable got 1 small square. The starch got another. There was a logic to it that felt almost architectural. You were not just eating dinner. You were eating a diagram of dinner, a tidy little argument for how a plate ought to be organized, pressed flat into aluminum and frozen at 0 degrees. The turkey dinner was the flagship, and it carried that responsibility seriously. The turkey arrived sliced, laid over cornbread dressing, with sweet potatoes in 1 compartment and peas in another. It was a meal that knew its references. It was reaching toward Thanksgiving, toward abundance, toward the specific American idea of a proper dinner without requiring any of the actual labor that a proper dinner usually demanded. The dressing was seasoned. The sweet potatoes were sweet. The peas were peas. Fried chicken changed the conversation. Fried chicken had texture in a way the turkey did not. The coating crisped in the oven in a way that felt almost too good to be true for something that had been in the freezer that morning. Swanson figured out the breading the way a code gets cracked, through enough attempts that eventually something worked, and the result was a frozen fried chicken that genuinely delivered on the box. People who bought it once bought it again immediately. That is the test. Salisbury steak was the philosophical choice. It was a meal for the person who wanted beef, but wanted it in a form that came with gravy and a sense of occasion. The name helped. Named after a physician who had promoted ground beef as a health food decades earlier, Salisbury steak sounded like something, even if what it sounded like was slightly different from what it was. The gravy arrived in the tray, and it did the essential work of making everything around it taste better than it would have tasted alone. The fish dinner never quite found its footing. Fish is a harder sell than chicken or beef, even in the best circumstances. And frozen fish in the early 1960s was not the best circumstances. The texture was the issue. Fish changes in ways that chicken and beef do not during freezing and reheating, and the fish dinner never fully solved that problem. It remained in the lineup for years, sold steadily to the people who wanted it, and never became anyone's first choice, which is not the worst thing a meal can be. What Swanson had built across those 4 or 5 original options was a vocabulary, a small grammar of frozen dinner that told the American household, here are the things we do. Here are the proteins, here are the starches, Here are the vegetables that keep their shape and color under these conditions. The vocabulary was limited. It was deliberately limited, because limitation in 1955 was not a problem, it was a relief. There was one turkey dinner. You either wanted it or you did not. The decision was simple, and simplicity on a weeknight with the television on and the children restless and everyone hungry was its own form of grace. Let us talk about the foil, because the foil deserves its own moment. Every TV dinner came sealed under a sheet of aluminum foil that was in theory easy to manage and in practice a minor physical challenge every single time. You were supposed to peel it back at one corner to vent. The instructions were printed right there on the box. And yet something about the combination of hot aluminum and hungry impatience made the operation go slightly wrong almost every time. You would pull too fast, and the foil would tear unevenly. You would pull too slow, and the steam would rush up at your wrist. Or you would do everything right and then set the tray down wrong, and the liquid from the vegetables would run into the dessert compartment, and suddenly your brownie had a mashed potato problem. The foil was thin, thinner than you remembered every time you handled it. It had a particular give to it that was not quite tearing and not quite bending, but something in between. A grudging compliance that meant you had to be deliberate about it, or it would do something you did not intend. You learned, after enough dinners, to grip it near the edge and pull at a low angle rather than straight up. You learned which corner of your particular brand vented best. You accumulated this knowledge quietly, the way you accumulate all kitchen knowledge, through small failures that never feel worth mentioning, but that you do not repeat. The oven mitt was essential, and also never quite where you left it. The tray itself was thin enough that even through the mitt you could feel the heat building in the aluminum, the whole tray conducting warmth upward through your palms as you moved it from the oven rack to the tray table. You had to move with purpose. There was no casual strolling from oven to couch with a hot TV dinner tray. You moved like someone carrying something that meant business. Then came the moment of opening. Full foil removal for some brands, partial peel back for others, and the instructions on this point were important, because getting it wrong changed the texture of everything underneath. Leave the foil on too long, and the top of the meal steamed rather than crisped. Take it off too early and things dried out around the edges. The window between these two outcomes was not enormous, and the oven thermometer in most 1960s home ovens was optimistic rather than accurate, which added a margin of uncertainty to the whole enterprise. And then the steam. When you pulled the foil back on a properly cooked TV dinner, the steam came up in a column that smelled of the meal and something else underneath it, something mineral and hot, and aluminum adjacent that you cannot describe to someone who has not experienced it, and that immediately transports you back to the 1960s if you ever have. It is a smell that has no modern equivalent, because nothing is cooked in this exact way anymore. The closest thing is the smell of a car in a summer parking lot, which is also aluminum and heat but without the gravy, and which is not nearly as welcoming. The foil went in the trash. Sometimes it went in the sink first and then the trash. The tray stayed, because the tray was the plate, and you ate from it directly with a fork, the fork sometimes catching on the ridges of the compartment walls, making a small scraping sound against the aluminum that was part of the audio of Tuesday evenings in 1963. Nobody complained about this sound. It was just dinner happening, in its particular way, in its particular material, in the particular light of a living room with a television on. There was something deeply satisfying about the compartmentalized tray, and it is worth sitting with that for a moment before rushing past it. In the 1960s, the idea that your peas would not touch your potatoes was not a small thing. It was a minor triumph of engineering applied to daily life. The compartment was a promise. Each thing gets its own space. Each element of your meal arrives intact. Nothing bleeds into anything else unless you want it to. This felt modern. This felt controlled. The rest of life in 1962 might have been uncertain, but the TV dinner tray had boundaries, and they held. More or less. The corn sometimes crossed the line regardless. The corn always crossed the line. This is important to acknowledge. No matter how precisely the compartment wall was formed, the corn, once it became warm and the butter in its compartment liquefied, found the lowest available point and began moving toward it. This was a structural reality of the tray's design that 1960s engineering never fully solved. You accepted it. The corn getting into the mashed potatoes was not a crisis. It was a minor negotiation between two foods that had decided they were compatible, and most of the time they were right. But the philosophy of the compartment went beyond keeping foods separate. It was about portion and intention. Each component of the meal had been measured and placed. The size of the protein compartment told you how much protein you were having. The vegetable compartment told you the vegetable situation for this particular evening. Nothing was approximate. Nothing required you to serve yourself or decide how much was enough. The tray decided. This was either tremendously liberating or mildly infantilizing, depending on your disposition. And in the 1960s, most people found it tremendously liberating, at least on a weeknight. There is a theory, not a formal one, just an observation, that Americans in the 1960s had a particular appetite for systems. The country had just come through a war that had been won in large part by logistics, by supply chains and standardization, and the precise delivery of the right thing to the right place at the right time. The TV dinner tray was a domestic expression of that same logic. Everything in its place, everything accounted for. The meal, like the war effort before it, organized and executed with a satisfying click of things fitting together correctly. Your mother may have had opinions about the compartment. Some mothers loved it because it meant the children would eat each component separately and not mix everything into a pile and call it a meal. Other mothers found the whole arrangement a little clinical, a little too much like a school lunch tray, which was not the feeling they were going for, even on the easiest of Tuesday evenings. These were legitimate and opposing responses to the same aluminum tray, and both of them were right. What the compartment gave you, at its best, was the experience of a complete meal in a contained form. You could look down at the tray and see dinner, the protein, the starch, the vegetable, the small sweet thing in the corner. It was a meal that had been thought through on your behalf, and all that was required of you was a fork and 25 minutes. In a decade that was asking a great deal of most people in most directions, that particular form of thoughtfulness was not nothing. It was, in its aluminum way, a small act of care, pressed into a tray and frozen until you needed it. By the mid-1960s, Swanson had noticed something. Some people were eating 2 TV dinners, not because they were wasteful or especially hungry, but because one tray, at around 11 ounces, was leaving a certain type of person, usually a large, hard-working, take-no-prisoners kind of person, still looking at the television and thinking about food. The Hungry Man line was the company's answer to that problem. More protein, larger portions, a tray that did not apologize for its ambitions. The Hungry Man became its own kind of statement, a TV dinner for people who found regular TV dinners a little dainty. Ordering one off a menu at a diner would have been embarrassing. Pulling one out of your own freezer was a matter of personal pride. The Hungry Man was bigger in every direction. The protein portion was nearly double the standard tray. The sides were more generous. The whole tray had a weight to it that the regular dinner did not. A heft when you lifted it from the freezer that communicated something. This is a serious meal. This is not a meal for someone who is mildly peckish. This is a meal for someone who has been somewhere and done something and now requires sustenance, proportional to that effort. The marketing knew exactly who it was talking to. It was talking to men. Not all men, and not exclusively men, but the cultural image of the hungry man buyer was specific and did not include ambiguity about appetite. This was the 1960s, and the advertising language of the era spoke in types. The hungry man was for the type who worked with his hands, or worked long hours, or played sports, or simply ran large and found the standard portions of modern life consistently insufficient. The hungry man said, "We see you. We made more." What is interesting, looking back at it, is how the hungry man managed to make eating a larger frozen dinner feel like a declaration rather than an admission. There was a possible embarrassment attached to the TV dinner in certain circles, a sense that real food required preparation and that the aluminum tray was a shortcut. The hungry man sidestepped this by leaning into appetite rather than convenience. It was not that you were too tired to cook, it was that you were too hungry for the regular one. That is a different kind of story, and it landed differently. The hungry man fried chicken was particularly successful. The additional chicken pieces meant that you got variety in your protein, which the standard dinner's single piece could not always offer. The mashed potatoes were a more substantial portion. The whole tray took longer in the oven, which was fine, because the hungry man buyer was not someone who expected things to be instant. He expected them to be sufficient, and sufficient took the time it took. There is something quietly poignant about the fact that the hungry man line has outlasted almost everything else from the 1960s TV dinner era. The brand is still in grocery store freezers today, still carrying that same promise of more. The meals are different now, packaged differently, cooked differently, but the name is unchanged. Hungry Man. It is a name from a specific moment in American food history, when appetite was something you announced rather than managed, when a bigger portion was its own argument, when the freezer held exactly what you needed and what you needed was considerable. If you were a kid who watched your father pull a hungry man out of the freezer on a Friday night, you knew the evening had a shape to it. The shape was, Dad is home, Dad is hungry, Dad has a plan for dinner, and that plan involves an aluminum tray the size of a small landing pad. Everything else would sort itself out from there. Let us take a moment of respectful silence for the brownie. The small, dense, slightly overcooked brownie that lived in the corner compartment of certain Swanson dinners and asked very little of you except that you eat it last, which nobody ever actually did. The brownie was technically a dessert. In practice, it was a reward system built into the tray. A small chocolate argument for finishing your Salisbury steak before helping yourself to the good part. It was never a great brownie by any objective standard. It was dry at the edges and occasionally rubbery in the middle, and it had probably been frozen for longer than it would ever admit. But it was there. It was yours. And it lived in its own little square, which meant nobody could take it. The brownie arrived in the tray already cooked, then frozen, then reheated in the same oven as the Salisbury steak and the mashed potatoes and the corn. This was not ideal conditions for a brownie. A brownie benefits from being eaten shortly after it is made, from a certain moisture in its center that the freezing and reheating process was not particularly kind to. The TV dinner brownie understood this about itself and did not complain. It simply was what it was. Warm, chocolatey in intent, with a texture somewhere between cake and a decision. Children understood the brownie's position in the meal with a clarity that no adult ever needed to explain. The brownie was last. This was not a rule that was written anywhere. It was a rule that existed in the same category as other unspoken rules of childhood. The ones you absorb by watching how things work and understanding that some things have an order to them and the order matters. You ate the peas first because peas were the most resistible thing on the tray and you wanted them done. You ate the Salisbury steak in the middle, because the Salisbury steak was the main event, and the main event required the proper approach. And the brownie was last, a small chocolate reward for having navigated everything else correctly. Some children, of course, ate the brownie first. You know who you are. And you probably still eat dessert first and have a complicated relationship with authority. The brownie revealed things about character that nothing else on the tray had the capacity to reveal. It was, in its small aluminum square, a personality test. The Swanson brownie appeared in the lineup in the early 1960s, and its presence varied by product line. Not every Swanson dinner had one. The fried chicken dinner had it at certain points and not others. The turkey dinner's dessert compartment shifted over the years between different small sweet things. But when the brownie was there, its presence was felt. It elevated the tray. It changed the meal from dinner into dinner, plus something to look forward to, and the distance between those two things is larger than it sounds. When the dessert compartment was eventually phased out across most product lines, the brownie went with it, quietly and without announcement, the way small beloved things often leave. Nobody organized a campaign to bring it back. Nobody wrote letters. It simply stopped appearing in the corner of the tray, and the corner became another vegetable, or nothing at all, and people adjusted, because that is what people do. But there are those who remember the brownie specifically, who can describe its exact dimensions and its particular slightly too done edge, who ate hundreds of TV dinners after the brownie was gone and felt each time that something was slightly incomplete about the arrangement. The brownie in the corner was not a great brownie, but it was exactly the right brownie. Swanson gets most of the credit, but it did not feed the 1960s alone. Banquet Foods was right there, offering meals at a price point that made Swanson look almost luxurious. Banquet's logic was simple: cheap, fast, plentiful. Their fried chicken dinners became a particular staple in households where the budget was tight and the kids were hungry, and nobody had 45 minutes to spare on a Tuesday. Morton, meanwhile, carved out its own loyal following with pot pies that became something close to a religion in certain parts of the country. The Banquet and Morton buyer and the Swanson buyer were not always the same person. There were allegiances, there were opinions. There are people reading this right now who will tell you that their mother's brand was the correct brand, and that is simply the end of the discussion. Banquet understood something that the higher-priced competitors sometimes lost sight of, that the primary promise of a frozen dinner was not excellence. It was reliability at a price that did not require justification. You could pull a Banquet dinner out of the freezer without doing any math. It cost what it cost, which was very little, and it delivered what it delivered, which was dinner. Hot, complete, sufficient. This is not a small achievement. In fact, it is the achievement. The meal that costs too much to be a weeknight default is not doing the job the TV dinner was invented to do. The Banquet fried chicken dinner had devoted followers who would not hear a word against it. The chicken had its own particular coating, its own flavor profile, its own way of arriving in the oven and emerging 25 minutes later with a crunch that was not Swanson's crunch and was not trying to be. It was Banquet's crunch, and people who grew up on it found other frozen fried chickens subtly wrong in ways they could not fully articulate. The sides were simple. The mashed potatoes were the mashed potatoes of a brand that was not trying to impress you, which paradoxically was impressive. Morton's contribution was the pot pie, and the pot pie was its own universe. Morton chicken pot pies and beef pot pies and turkey pot pies occupied the freezer case in their round tins, with a quiet confidence that suggested they had been there before everything else and expected to be there after. The Morton pot pie was not a TV dinner in the segmented aluminum tray sense. It was its own thing. But it fed the same hunger, answered the same question of what is for dinner tonight, and delivered a particular comfort that the flat tray format could not quite replicate. The pot pie was round. The pot pie had a crust. The pot pie was warm all the way through in a way that felt almost architectural, a constructed warmth that held together the way a well-built thing holds together. There was also Swanson's own pot pie, which competed with Morton's, and the question of which was better was one of those household-level debates that never got fully resolved because the answer depended entirely on who you asked and which freezer they had been raised in front of. These debates were not heated exactly. They were the quiet, persistent kind, the kind where everyone states their position once, and then the topic is closed until someone brings it up again, which someone always does. The competition between these brands was good for everyone eating frozen dinners in the 1960s. It kept prices low. It encouraged incremental improvements in quality. It produced a diversity of options in the freezer case that meant you were rarely eating the same thing 2 weeks in a row unless you chose to. The American frozen dinner aisle in 1965 was a modest but genuine plurality, and every household had its brand loyalties, its opinions, its reasons that its particular brand was the correct one. Those reasons were almost always the same reason. That was what my mother bought. And that reason, as reasons go, is completely sound. Salisbury steak is one of the great unsung heroes of the 1960s freezer aisle, and it has suffered under a reputation it did not entirely deserve. Named for a 19th century physician who believed ground beef was good for the digestion, Salisbury steak was essentially a shaped meat patty served in brown gravy, and in the context of a TV dinner tray at 350 degrees, it was genuinely fine. More than fine. On a cold evening with a game show on the television and nothing requiring your immediate attention. The gravy did most of the heavy lifting. The meat provided the occasion. Together, they produced something that was not a hamburger and not a roast and not quite either thing, but that occupied its own warm and specific place in the 1960s dinner vocabulary. The name was doing a great deal of work. Salisbury steak sounds like something. It sounds like it was served in a hotel dining room at some point in history, by someone with a white jacket and a cart. The physician James Henry Salisbury had promoted his ground beef prescription in the 1880s as a treatment for a variety of ailments, including the digestion problems that he believed were caused by too many vegetables and starches. He recommended eating ground beef 2 or 3 times a day. This is not current medical advice, but it gave the meal a name with a certain authority to it, a name that implied the patty on your tray had lineage and intention, even frozen at 0 degrees in a Swanson box. The gravy was the key. This is the thing that Salisbury steak detractors often overlook. They focus on the meat, which was processed and shaped and had the texture of ground beef that had been through several interventions before arriving on your tray. But the gravy was different. The gravy was seasoned and warm, and it pooled around the patty and seeped into the edges of the mashed potato compartment in a way that enriched everything it touched. The mashed potatoes with Salisbury steak gravy were better than the mashed potatoes without it. The whole arrangement was better than the sum of its parts, which is the definition of a well-conceived dish, whether it arrives in a restaurant or in an aluminum tray. You could eat Salisbury steak and feel the dinner had happened. This is not as easy to achieve as it sounds. Some meals leave you technically full but existentially unfulfilled, aware that calories have been consumed but not convinced that anything meaningful has occurred. Salisbury steak did not leave you in that condition. It was a complete and committed meal. It made no excuses. The patty was the patty. The gravy was the gravy. The peas in the adjacent compartment were the peas, slightly overcooked in the way all TV dinner peas were slightly overcooked, but present and accounted for, doing their part. Children had complicated relationships with the Salisbury steak dinner. Some loved it and requested it with the enthusiasm usually reserved for fried chicken. Others approached it with the suspicion that children bring to any protein that has been shaped into a form different from its original form. What is this? Why is it this shape? These are reasonable questions about a ground beef patty, and the answers, because it was formed in a mold. Because a physician in the 1880s thought this was the ideal configuration for consuming ground beef. Did not always satisfy a 7-year-old, but for the adults who ate it without suspicion, the Salisbury steak TV dinner was a reliable Tuesday. It was exactly what it said it was, and it delivered exactly what it offered, and in the 1960s that combination of honesty and warmth and brown gravy was more than sufficient. It was dinner. Honestly and squarely and without apology. Which, on a Tuesday, is everything you need. There is something a little melancholy and a little wonderful about the fact that the meal that started the entire TV dinner industry was Thanksgiving turkey. Because Thanksgiving, in the American imagination, is the meal that requires the most preparation, the most relatives, the most elaborate performance of abundance. And here was Swanson saying, we can put that in a box. You can have it on a Wednesday. You can have it alone, in front of the television, without the relatives, without the performance, without any of it. This was either a beautiful democratization of the holiday meal or a gentle tragedy, depending on your mood. Most people in the 1960s seemed to feel it was the former. The turkey dinner sold extremely well. The specifics of the Swanson turkey dinner were thought through with more care than is usually given to a 98-cent frozen meal. The turkey was sliced and laid over cornbread dressing that had been seasoned with sage and onion in a way that reached, however approximately, for the flavor of an actual Thanksgiving stuffing. The sweet potatoes in their compartment were soft and sweet and buttery in a way that suggested someone at Swanson had eaten a real Thanksgiving dinner recently and was trying to point in that direction. The peas were peas. The peas were always peas. Nobody expects the peas to transport you anywhere. The dressing was the part that surprised people. Cornbread dressing underneath turkey slices is an arrangement with genuine logic to it, the same logic that makes the stuffing the most contested part of the actual holiday meal. Because stuffing or dressing is what holds the flavor of the bird and amplifies it and carries it into the edges of the plate where the other things are. The TV dinner dressing was a reduced and frozen version of that function, but it was attempting the same thing, and the attempt was recognizable. Eating the Swanson turkey dinner in February had a particular effect. It was winter. The living room was warm. The tray was warm. And the flavor of the turkey and the sage dressing pulled the month of November into the room without being asked. This was not just nostalgia. It was a genuine triggering of food memory, which is one of the most powerful forms of memory that exists. The smell of sage dressing in a warm room is November, regardless of what month the calendar says. Swanson had accidentally created a time machine that ran on a household oven and cost less than $1. There were people who ate the turkey TV dinner specifically on holidays they spent alone, not out of sadness exactly, but because the meal made the occasion real in a way that a sandwich did not. If you were working through Christmas and eating dinner by yourself in front of the television, and you had a Swanson turkey dinner on your tray table, that was still Christmas dinner. It had the components. It had the intention. The tray was making an effort on your behalf, and that effort was not nothing. The turkey dinner also made an argument that other TV dinner options could not make as forcefully. That frozen food was not just cheap food, it was aspirational food. Food pointing toward the best meals in the American memory. Food trying to close the distance between an ordinary Tuesday and an extraordinary November. Whether it fully closed that distance is another question. But the attempt was genuine, the flavor was in the right direction, and the cornbread dressing under the turkey slices smelled, on a cold February evening in front of the television, exactly like coming home. It is Friday evening now, and the question of what is for dinner has been answered before anyone even got home. The Swanson Fried Chicken TV dinner was, by most accounts, the best thing the company ever put in an aluminum tray, and it was not particularly close. The chicken arrived crispy in a way that felt genuinely miraculous, given that it had been frozen solid an hour ago. The skin had something to it. The whipped potatoes in their little compartment were warm and yielding and generous with the butter flavor. If there were 2 of these in the freezer, somebody was getting there first, and the other person was eating turkey and accepting the situation. The breading was the achievement. Swanson spent real effort on the breading, and it showed in the way it behaved in the oven. Most coatings on frozen chicken softened during freezing and emerged from the oven pale and defeated, a coating that had given up somewhere between the factory and your kitchen. The Swanson breading did not do this. It came out with color. It came out with a crunch that was not the crunch of fresh fried chicken, which nothing frozen could fully replicate, but was a distinct and satisfying crunch of its own. A crunch that had made peace with what it was and delivered on that basis. This is a kind of integrity, and it deserves to be named as such. The piece of chicken itself mattered. The positioning of the chicken in the tray, the way it sat over the large compartment with authority, said something about the meal's confidence in itself. A drumstick and a thigh, or sometimes a thigh and a breast portion, depending on the product run and the year. The size varied slightly, which meant every now and then you got a particularly generous piece, and every now and then you got one that made you question the quality control in Omaha. But on average, the chicken was what it said it was. A piece of fried chicken that had survived freezing and reheating and arrived on your tray table with its dignity largely intact. The sides on the fried chicken dinner were simpler than on some other Swanson options, which was correct. Fried chicken does not need complex accompaniments. It needs mashed potatoes and a vegetable that knows its place. The mashed potatoes on the fried chicken dinner were smooth and buttery in the way that only a product engineered to taste buttery can consistently achieve, because real butter varies and engineering does not. The corn, or the peas, in the adjacent compartment were there to fulfill the vegetable obligation, which they did without fanfare, which is exactly what a vegetable at a fried chicken dinner is supposed to do. Children fought over the fried chicken dinner with a directness they did not apply to other TV dinner varieties. The turkey was accepted with equanimity. The Salisbury steak was eaten without drama. But the fried chicken dinner produced negotiation, produced the careful counting of how many were in the freezer and who had eaten one most recently, and whether it was fair that one person always seemed to get there first. These were important questions in households with more than one child and a limited freezer supply, and they were asked with the full seriousness that resource allocation deserves. The fried chicken TV dinner was not Southern fried chicken. It was not your grandmother's recipe. It was not the chicken from the diner downtown, or the church picnic, or any other reference point that fried chicken carries in the American food memory. It was its own thing, a frozen thing, a 1960s thing, and within that category, it was very good. Sometimes very good, within the category you are actually in, is more satisfying than almost good at being something else entirely. The Swanson fried chicken dinner understood this about itself. It was very good at being exactly what it was. The pot pie deserves its own segment because it is not quite a TV dinner, and not quite anything else either, and it occupied its own faithful corner of the 1960s freezer with total self-assurance. Morton and Swanson both made them. Banquet made them. They were round, and they had a crust on top that, if you handled it correctly, came out golden and slightly flaky, and if you handled it incorrectly, came out pale and soft and apologetic. The filling was vegetables and meat in a cream sauce that was less about any individual ingredient and more about the whole warm enterprise of them together. The pot pie was not glamorous. It did not arrive in a segmented tray with a brownie in the corner. It came in a little tin cup, and it asked only that you give it 25 minutes and a working oven, and in return, it would take care of the rest of your evening. The crust was everything. The pot pie lived or died by the crust, and everybody who ate one regularly knew this and calibrated their oven management accordingly. Too little time, and the crust stayed pale and doughy, a crust that had not committed to being a crust with doubts. Too much time, and the edges burned while the center stayed raw, a situation that was both aesthetically and practically frustrating. The window of correct doneness was not enormous, and the home ovens of the 1960s, with their analog dials and their approximate thermostats, did not make hitting that window any easier. You learned your oven. You made adjustments. You developed a relationship with your particular appliance that was less like operating a machine and more like negotiating with a personality. The filling inside the correct crusted pot pie was the reward for the management and the waiting. A chicken pot pie from Morton in 1964 contained pieces of chicken in a cream sauce with peas and carrots and sometimes corn. All of it thickened to a consistency that was somewhere between soup and stew and exactly right for a small round tin. The vegetables were soft. The chicken was present. The sauce tied everything together with the authority of something that had been reduced to its essential warmth and had no intention of being anything else. Beef pot pies operated on the same principle with different ingredients, and the beef produced a slightly richer, darker filling that had its own logic. Turkey pot pies arrived after Thanksgiving, when turkey was on the mind of every frozen food executive in the country, and they sold well through the winter months before retreating for the rest of the year. The chicken variety was the constant. The chicken pot pie was there in January and July and on random Wednesdays in March, and it was always the same, and the sameness was the comfort. The pot pie was a solo meal in a way the segmented tray dinner was not. The tray dinner could be shared in spirit, aligned with others at their own tray tables in the living room. The pot pie, in its round individual tin, was yours alone. It came out of the oven at a temperature that immediately discouraged sharing, even if you had wanted to. You held it carefully in a kitchen towel, set it on your tray table, and waited the additional 3 minutes that the instructions recommended and that represented an almost impossible exercise in restraint given how good it smelled. That smell deserves its own sentence. A chicken pot pie coming out of the oven smells like everything good about cold weather and warm kitchens and the particular safety of a house where dinner is already handled. There is no sophisticated way to describe it. It smells like a pot pie. And if you grew up eating pot pies in the 1960s, that smell is its own complete memory, its own door into a specific room in a specific house, on a specific winter evening when everything was fine and dinner was round and had a crust. The box mattered. People forget this, but the box mattered enormously in the 1960s TV dinner economy because the box was the entire sales pitch standing up in a freezer case at the grocery store, behind a glass door that fogged when you opened it. Swanson's boxes showed the meal as it theoretically appeared. The turkey sliced neatly, the potatoes smooth and peaked, the peas bright and separate. The reality inside the tray was more approximate than the box suggested, but the box was aspirational, and aspiration was part of what you were buying. The photography was honest in spirit, if not always in detail, and the color of the box was bright enough to find in a freezer even when your glasses were fogged. The photography on a Swanson box in 1962 was a specific kind of professional optimism. The photographer's job was to make ground beef patty and gravy look like dinner, to make sliced frozen turkey look like it had just come off a platter, to make the small vegetable compartment look like a vegetable situation anyone would choose freely. This required lighting and props and a food stylist's willingness to use materials that would photograph well without being required to taste like anything at all. The mashed potatoes on the box were frequently not mashed potatoes. The gravy had often been thickened past the point of edibility to hold its shape under studio lights. The peas were selected individually. None of this was deceptive in the way that modern advertising regulations would scrutinize. It was simply the convention of the era. Food photography was understood to be aspirational rather than documentary. You looked at the box and understood that this was the direction, not the guarantee. You bought the product knowing it would be in the neighborhood of what was pictured and accepting that the neighborhood might be a few blocks away from the photograph. This was a reasonable arrangement, and most people navigated it without complaint. The banquet box was less elaborate in its photography and more direct in its pricing communication. The banquet box wanted you to know, before anything else, that this meal was affordable, and the design communicated that priority clearly. Less glossy, more straightforward. The box of a brand that had decided its customer already knew what they were buying and just needed to find it quickly in a cold freezer case. There is an honesty to that approach that the more elaborate packaging of premium brands sometimes lacked. Morton's pot pie box was simple by necessity and by choice. A round product and a round tin as limited surface area to work with, and Morton used what it had without overreaching. The box showed the pot pie. The pot pie looked like a pot pie. The crust looked like it would be golden if you did things correctly, which was true. The box made no promises that the product could not keep, which put it in a select category of 1960s consumer packaging. What all these boxes shared was the function of promise-making in a cold environment. The freezer case was not a glamorous retail setting. It was cold and loud, with compressor hum, and the glass doors left condensation on your hand when you pulled them open. The boxes were working hard against those conditions, trying to make frozen food feel like an invitation rather than a compromise. On the good days, with the right product and the right customer at the right moment, on the right Tuesday evening, they succeeded. You pulled the box from the freezer, felt its cold weight in your hand, and felt the particular satisfaction of a decision made and a problem solved. The box went in the trash after you read the instructions. The tray stayed. But the box had done its job before it got there, and the job it did was not nothing. The marketing of the TV dinner in the 1960s was aimed, with remarkable directness, at women, specifically at the idea that cooking dinner every night was a labor that the modern woman should not have to perform alone every single evening of her life. The aluminum tray was positioned as freedom. 25 minutes and it was done. No pots, no cleanup, no standing over a hot stove while everyone else sat in front of the television. Some women embraced this completely and felt the relief of it in their bones. Others were less certain. Dinner had been a domain, a skill, a form of care that meant something. Handing it to Swanson felt, to some, like handing away something that could not entirely be replaced by convenience. The advertising of the era showed women smiling. Women who were not tired, who were not standing over a stove with their hair pinned back and their patience thinning. Women who were setting tray tables with the ease of people who had found a better arrangement. The message was delivered gently but consistently. The TV dinner is what a modern household does. The modern household does not require the woman to cook from scratch every single evening. The modern household has options. What the advertising did not show, and what was happening in actual kitchens, was more complicated. Some women found the TV dinner genuinely useful on specific nights, a tool for the evenings when everything else had demanded too much. They used it the way they used any tool, strategically and without guilt, and went back to cooking the other 5 nights of the week without any sense that the arrangement had changed anything fundamental. These were women who had the confidence to decide what the TV dinner was for and use it accordingly. Others felt the pressure of the modern differently. The TV dinner arrived at the same time as a broader cultural conversation about what women were supposed to want, and that conversation was not always coherent. You were supposed to want convenience. You were also supposed to want to take care of your family. If convenience meant not cooking, what did not cooking mean about the care? These were not idle anxieties. They were real questions being asked by real women in real kitchens who were trying to figure out which direction modern pointed. The women who were not sure about the TV dinner often compromised. They might serve a TV dinner but add something made from scratch alongside it, a salad, a homemade dessert, a pot of coffee they had percolated themselves. This was not deceit. It was negotiation with the idea that dinner was a performance of care, and that the performance required some proof of effort somewhere in the meal. The aluminum tray handled the main event. The rest of the table handled the proof. By the end of the 1960s, as the women's movement was articulating ideas about labor and domestic work and the unequal distribution of both, the TV dinner acquired a new kind of meaning. It was still convenient. It was still fast. But it was also, for some, a small symbol of something larger. The idea that the work of feeding a family should not fall entirely and automatically to one person, and that if a tray from Swanson took 20 minutes off the evening, those 20 minutes belonged to whoever had been feeding everyone all along. The TV dinner did not cause any of this to change, but it was present in the kitchen while it was changing, which means it was part of the story. And the story of who cooked and who did not, and what that meant, is still, in its updated forms, very much being written. If you were a child in the 1960s, the TV dinner was not a convenience or a novelty or a statement about modernity. It was just dinner. It was the thing that happened on the nights your mother was tired or working or had somewhere to be, or simply had earned the right to not cook. You did not analyze this. You sat down with your tray table in front of you and the television going, and you started with whatever looked best, which was almost never the vegetable, and you worked your way through the tray with the focused attention of a small person who has priorities and knows what they are. The brownie went last, or it went first, depending entirely on your personal character, and your personal character was already fully formed by age 7. The television was the other half of the experience, and as a child, you understood this instinctively. The TV dinner was named for the television, and the television was named alongside the dinner, and the two things together made an arrangement that was simply correct in the way that milk with cereal is correct, or peanut butter with jelly is correct. You did not eat a TV dinner in the kitchen at the table. That would be like watching television without turning the sound on. The form required the living room. The form required the tray table. The form required the screen. What you watched mattered and did not matter at the same time. It mattered in the sense that certain shows were better TV dinner shows than others, better companions for the particular activity of eating from a compartmentalized aluminum tray on a folding table in the living room. Game shows were excellent. The movement of the game, the small excitements, and the regular rhythms matched the pace of eating in a way that more demanding programming did not. Westerns were good. Westerns had long stretches of landscape and writing that gave you time to address the mashed potatoes without missing anything important. The news was not a TV dinner show. The news required attention that the TV dinner, with its foil peeling and its compartment navigation, could not always spare. Your mother's relationship to the TV dinner evening was something you perceived without fully understanding. On the nights the tray tables came out, she was often different, less managed, less directed toward the next thing. She sat with her own tray and watched the same show and laughed at the same moments, and the evening felt more parallel. more like being in the same place rather than one person serving and others being served. You did not have the vocabulary for this as a child. You just knew it felt different in a way that was good. The ritual of the tray had a completeness to it that children responded to. The tray was yours. Everything on it was accounted for. You did not have to ask for more of something or less of something or whether there was enough. The tray was the answer to all of those questions, already determined, already sealed under foil, already in the oven working toward your dinner. There is a security in that kind of predetermined completeness that children understand better than adults, because children spend most of their lives in conditions where things are not predetermined and not complete and not sealed under foil heading toward resolution. When you are grown and you think back to the TV dinner evenings, what you remember is not the food exactly. You remember the light in the room, the sound of the television, the particular warmth of the tray in your lap, your mother on the couch, with her own tray, watching the same thing you were watching. You remember being small and warm and fed, in a room that was doing exactly what rooms are supposed to do. The aluminum tray held the dinner. The room held everything else. A Swanson turkey TV dinner in 1963 cost 98 cents. A Morton pot pie cost less than that. Banquet's fried chicken dinner could be had for similar money. This was not nothing. $1 in 1963 was $1 that had weight to it. But in the context of feeding a family on a weeknight, the TV dinner was genuinely competitive with the cost of cooking at home once you accounted for ingredients and time and the general effort of the thing. For households where both parents worked, or where a single parent was managing everything alone, the math was simple. The tray was affordable. The tray was fast. The tray did not require you to have been to the grocery store that specific day, which was the kind of flexibility that 1960s life did not always offer. $1 in 1963 purchased things that $1 today cannot begin to approach, and this is worth sitting with for a moment. A gallon of gasoline cost around 30 cents. A loaf of bread was around 20 cents. A movie ticket was around 70 cents. In this context, 98 cents for a complete dinner with multiple components, already prepared and requiring only an oven, was not the obvious bargain it appears to be from today's vantage point. It was a reasonable expenditure. It was a considered purchase. Families who bought TV dinners regularly were spending real money on them, and they were making that choice deliberately. The calculation that made the TV dinner cost competitive was partly about ingredients and partly about time. Cooking a meal from scratch in 1963 required grocery shopping, which required a trip to the store, which required a car or a bus or a walk, which required time on top of the time cooking itself required. The TV dinner was already in the freezer. The freezer was in the kitchen. The kitchen was right there. For a household managing multiple demands on a weeknight, the absence of the shopping trip was worth something real, something that did not show up in the price comparison, but that anyone running a household felt in their body. Single-parent households found the TV dinner economics particularly compelling. A mother or father managing work and children and a home on one income in 1963 was engaged in a constant negotiation between cost and time and energy, and the TV dinner offered a favorable position in that negotiation. It was not the cheapest possible dinner. Rice and beans was cheaper. Soup from scratch was cheaper. But it was fast, and it was complete, and it did not require a clean pot afterward, and those qualities had a value that the price alone did not capture. The freezer itself was part of the economics. A household with a large chest freezer could buy TV dinners in quantity when they went on sale and store them for months, which changed the price calculation further in the buyer's favor. The promotion-minded shopper, who watched for the weekly specials in the grocery circular and planned the freezer accordingly, could eat TV dinners at a cost that made homemade cooking look expensive, by comparison, once all the inputs were counted honestly. What a dollar could do in 1963, applied to frozen food, was provide a complete dinner for one adult, or a partial dinner for a family that supplemented with a side salad and some bread, or a full dinner for a child who did not require hungry man portions. That range of application made the TV dinner a genuinely flexible tool in the household budget, one that could be deployed in different configurations depending on what the week required. A dollar that solves dinner, even approximately, is a dollar well spent. In 1963, it solved dinner with change left over. Here is where things get genuinely mournful, because the 1960s TV dinner roster included meals that no longer exist anywhere in the frozen food aisle and that are not coming back. There was a creamed chicken that arrived in a sauce so specific in its flavor that people who remember it cannot describe it except to say that it tasted like itself and nothing else. There were beef dishes with gravies that were not trying to be anything other than warm and brown and deeply satisfying. There were side dishes, a particular style of corn in butter sauce, a specific preparation of sweet potato that appeared in those aluminum compartments, and then, sometime in the 1970s, quietly did not appear anymore. Nobody announced their departure. They were simply gone, replaced by something more modern and slightly less of what they had been. The creamed chicken is the one people remember most specifically, which is interesting because creamed chicken is not a glamorous dish, even by the standards of the 1960s. It is chicken in a cream sauce, which sounds simple enough that you might think it could be replicated easily. But the particular creamed chicken that appeared in Swanson trays in the early part of the decade had a flavor that came from the specific combination of cream sauce base and seasoning and the way it behaved in the aluminum compartment during oven heating. And that combination has not been reproduced because nobody has tried to reproduce it exactly. The formula lived in the product. The product was discontinued. The formula went with it. This is how flavors disappear. Not through any dramatic decision, not through a press release or a reformulation announcement. A product is discontinued because the sales numbers have shifted, or the ingredient costs have changed, or the production line is needed for something newer. The flavor that lived in that product has no other home. It exists only in the memories of the people who ate it, where it lives with a specificity that other food memories often lack. Food memory is olfactory and gustatory and deeply physical, and the things that trigger it are precisely the things that are no longer available, which is one of the more elegant tortures of getting older. The sweet potato preparation in the Swanson turkey dinner was another casualty. The sweet potato compartment in the early years of the turkey dinner had a particular sweetness and a particular texture, smooth but not entirely pureed, that suggested the sweet potato had been treated with respect rather than efficiency. Somewhere in the late 1960s and early 1970s, that preparation shifted. The sweet potato remained, but it changed, became more processed, more uniform, more approximate. The people who had been eating the earlier version noticed immediately and said so to whoever would listen, which was usually only other people eating the same dinner who had also noticed. There were complete meal categories that existed briefly in the 1960s TV dinner market and then vanished before the decade was out. Seafood dinners beyond the basic fish fillet. Lamb dishes that reflected the broader range of American dinner tables before beef fully dominated the frozen aisle. Organ meat preparations that were still common enough in home cooking to have a frozen audience, but that retreated as dietary preferences shifted. These categories did not disappear from American cooking overnight. They faded, and as they faded from restaurants and home kitchens, they faded from the frozen aisle too, because the frozen aisle has always followed rather than lead. What remains is a freezer section that is in many ways larger and more diverse than what existed in 1963. But that is missing something specific and irreplaceable. The particular flavors of that particular decade, made by that particular technology, eaten in that particular arrangement, on a folding tray table in a living room where the television was the only screen and everyone in the room was watching the same thing. You cannot buy that combination anywhere. You can only remember it. The frozen food section of the grocery store in the 1960s was not the vast cathedral of options it became later. It was a row, maybe 2 rows, of glass-doored cases humming steadily in the back of the store, and the TV dinners lived there in their bright boxes, stacked upright so the photographs faced out. And choosing one felt like a small decision with a satisfying certainty to it. You knew what you were getting. You knew the brand. You knew the meal. You knew approximately how the evening was going to go. The frozen food section in 1963 was a room that made promises it mostly kept, which is a standard that not every room in the grocery store could meet. The glass doors of the freezer cases left a particular impression on your hand when you touched them. Cold, faintly damp from condensation, with a resistance when you pulled that was not quite a handle's worth of resistance, but more than a cabinet door's. You opened them with purpose, because standing with a freezer case door open in 1963 felt mildly presumptuous, like you were taking longer than your share of the cold air. You looked, you decided, you reached, you closed the door behind you. The whole transaction happened in under a minute. Choosing a TV dinner did not require deliberation the way choosing a cut of meat from the butcher required deliberation. You were choosing from a limited menu of known quantities, and the knowing was most of the comfort. The hum of the freezer cases was a specific sound within the broader soundscape of the grocery store. The store had its own sounds, the squeak of cartwheels, the thud of things being stocked on shelves, the conversation of the women at the checkout who knew each other by name. Underneath all of this was the compressor hum of the frozen food cases, steady and low, a mechanical sound that meant cold, and cold meant preserved, and preserved meant the thing you were looking at would still be good in 3 weeks if you needed it to be. There was a reassurance in that sound that you felt without thinking about it. The frozen food section in 1963 was still new enough to feel like progress. Frozen food had existed since the 1920s, when Clarence Birdseye commercialized the quick freeze process, but it had taken decades to become a normal part of how American households shopped and ate. By the early 60s, the freezer case was established but not taken for granted. People still remarked on the convenience of it. Mothers told their own mothers about what was available now, and the older women looked at the boxes with a mixture of interest and skepticism that every generation brings to the food technologies of the next one. What was in those freezer cases beyond the TV dinners tells you something about what the American household in 1963 was thinking about dinner. Frozen vegetables in bags, peas, corn, green beans, lima beans. Frozen juice concentrates that you mixed with water in a pitcher. Frozen fish sticks that occupied their own loyal market. Frozen pot pies. Frozen waffles, which were new and which people felt strongly about in both directions. The freezer case was a map of what convenience meant to a specific decade, and the TV dinner was the flagship product on that map, the one that the map was partly organized around. You could spend 5 minutes in front of those freezer cases and leave knowing exactly what you were having for dinner, which was not always true of the rest of the store. The produce section required judgment. The meat counter required a conversation with the butcher and a decision about price per pound and how many people you were feeding and whether you had time to do it properly. The freezer case required only that you know your brand and your budget and whether you wanted turkey or fried chicken. These are the kinds of decisions that a person can make without difficulty at the end of a long day. And the freezer case in the 1960s understood this about the people it was serving. The instructions were on the box, and they were simple, and they demanded a particular kind of patience that the 1960s still had in reserve. Preheat the oven to 350 degrees. Remove the outer box. Place the tray on a baking sheet. Cook for 25 minutes. These were not complicated instructions, but they required you to plan 25 minutes ahead of hunger, which is a deceptively difficult calculation. The preheat alone took 10 minutes on most ovens of the era, which meant the whole operation was closer to 40 minutes from decision to dinner. You learned to start the oven before you were hungry, or you ate standing up in the kitchen watching the clock, which was its own particular 1960s experience and one that had a strange, specific dignity to it. The oven in the 1960s American kitchen was not a precision instrument. It was a large metal box heated by gas or electric elements, controlled by a dial that had numbers on it, but that operated more on faith than on accuracy. 350 degrees on the dial meant something in the general neighborhood of 350 degrees inside the oven, the neighborhood being defined as anywhere between 320 and 380 on a good day, with wider variations possible depending on the age of the appliance and how recently the thermostat had been serviced, which was not recently. You knew your oven the way you know your own handwriting, not by its specifications, but by its particular tendencies, its hotter spots, its slower corners, the way it ran warm on cold mornings and slightly cool in the summer heat. The TV dinner instructions said 25 minutes, and you translated that into your oven's actual behavior based on accumulated experience. If your oven ran hot, you checked at 22. If your oven ran cool, you gave it 28 and watched for the color you were looking for around the edges. The baking sheet was essential and sometimes overlooked by people doing this for the first time. The TV dinner tray was thin aluminum that could warp under direct oven heat if placed on a rack without support, sending the gravy sliding toward one end and the peas toward the other in a slow aluminum catastrophe. The baking sheet stabilized everything. It distributed the heat from below with the evenness that the oven rack alone could not provide. Using the baking sheet was not optional, even when the instructions made it sound optional. People who skipped it learned from the consequences. The waiting was real. 40 minutes from the moment you decided on TV dinners to the moment the tray was on the table was a long time when you were hungry and the television was already on, and the day had been the kind of day that makes you want dinner to happen immediately. The kitchen clock in the 1960s moved at its own pace, which was slower than you wanted when the oven was working and faster than you wanted at every other moment. You set the timer if you had one. You watched the clock if you did not. You lifted the oven door twice during the process to check, and both times you let heat out and extended the cooking time by an amount you could never quite calculate. When the timer went off, or when the clock said enough time had passed, the retrieval was its own small ceremony. The oven mitt, the baking sheet, hot and requiring both hands. The transportation from oven to tray table, which happened at a faster than walking pace because the tray was hot and the living room was 30 feet away and patience had officially run out 10 minutes ago. You set it down. You gave it the recommended 3 additional minutes to cool, which you did not give it. And then dinner happened, warm and complete, and exactly as promised, 40 minutes after you decided it would. There was a social question attached to the TV dinner that nobody really talked about directly, which was the question of what you did when someone came over unexpectedly. The answer varied by household and by the particular confidence of the person running it. Some people set out TV dinner trays without apology, set them on the table instead of the tray tables, and treated the whole thing as dinner, which it was. Others hid the boxes before guests arrived and served the food as though it had been prepared. which worked reasonably well until someone asked what the meal was called. Others simply never served TV dinners to company on principle, not because they were embarrassed exactly, but because the TV dinner was private, a thing for Tuesday nights among yourselves, and some things did not need to be shared. The hiding of the box was a specific and understandable behavior that thousands of households engaged in without ever discussing it. You would slide the Swanson boxes into the space between the refrigerator and the wall, or push them to the back of the trash can under some other refuse, or simply take them straight to the outside bin before the guest arrived. The food itself could pass. Salisbury steak on a plate, transferred from the tray, looked like Salisbury steak. The mashed potatoes, decanted into a serving bowl, looked like mashed potatoes. The deception was not ambitious, and it was not really deception. It was presentation. What was being managed was a social perception that had less to do with the food than with what the food implied. Serving a TV dinner to a guest in 1963 implied, in certain social registers, that you had not made the effort that a guest warranted. Cooking for someone was a form of hospitality that carried weight, and the aluminum tray suggested that the weight had not been felt. This was not a universal perception. Working-class households often had no such anxiety about the TV dinner. The dinner was the dinner. It was good. It was warm. If you were a guest, you were grateful. The anxiety about the tray was more present in households trying to perform a certain kind of middle-class propriety, where the form of care mattered alongside the substance of it. The people who served TV dinners to guests without apology were onto something, and history has been kind to their confidence. The guest who was served a Swanson fried chicken dinner in a 1963 living room and made to feel welcome and included in the evening was having a better time than the guest who was served a mediocre homemade casserole with visible resentment at the effort it had required. The meal was never entirely the point. The evening was the point. The company was the point. The TV dinner, served with ease and without performance, was often a better social occasion than the elaborate meal served with the anxiety of its own preparation still visible in the host's posture. Children of TV dinner households internalized their parents' relationship to the social question and often reproduced it decades later, either with the same confidence or the same mild concealment, depending on which parent they most resembled. The child who grew up in a household where the Swanson box was hidden before company arrived grew up and either learned to hide it more efficiently or decided the hiding was unnecessary, and either choice was a complete response to the lesson that had been taught. What no one who served a TV dinner to a guest in the 1960s seems to remember is the guest complaining. The guest ate. The guest found the fried chicken satisfying, or the Salisbury steak agreeable, or the pot pie warm and complete. And the evening proceeded as evenings proceed when the food is sufficient and the company is good. The box was in the outside bin. The tray was on the table. Nobody said anything about it. That is a form of social success that all the elaborate cooking in the world cannot guarantee. The brownie did not disappear all at once. It faded, which is somehow worse. Through the middle years of the 1960s, the dessert compartment began appearing less consistently across brands and product lines. Some trays kept it. Others replaced it with something called an apple compote, which was apple adjacent, but which was not a brownie and made no pretense of being one. By the early 1970s, the dessert compartment had largely been retired across most of the major TV dinner brands, a victim of cost-cutting and the ongoing effort to shave a few cents off the price point. The people who grew up with the brownie in the corner noticed its absence immediately. The people who came after never knew what they were missing, which is the particular sadness of things that disappear before you arrive. The apple compote replacement deserves a moment of honest assessment. It was not bad. It was warm and slightly sweet, and it arrived in its little compartment with the same reliable presence the brownie had occupied, and on its own terms it did a reasonable job. But it was not the brownie. The brownie had been chocolate, which is not a neutral flavor. Chocolate at the end of a savory meal is a specific event, a small arrival, a change of register that the palate recognizes and responds to with something like gratitude. The apple compote was a continuation of the meal's general flavor territory, rather than a departure from it. It tidied things up rather than concluding them. There is a difference, and the people who had eaten the brownie felt the difference immediately and did not entirely forgive the compote for existing in its place. The cost accounting behind the brownie's disappearance was straightforward, even if it was not announced. Chocolate cost more than apple. The brownie compartment required a separate preparation process with different baking requirements than the rest of the tray, which meant additional complexity on the production line. As the 1960s moved into the early 70s and inflation began pressuring the economics of everything, the brownie was the kind of small luxury that the spreadsheet identified as removable. The spreadsheet was not wrong about the cost. It simply could not account for what the brownie meant, which is the limitation of spreadsheets and always has been. There is a broader pattern here that the brownie illustrates, which is the pattern of how small beloved things are lost from products over time. It almost never happens through a single dramatic decision. It happens incrementally, through a series of reasonable-seeming choices that each save a small amount of money or simplify a small amount of process. And the cumulative effect of these choices is that something which made a product what it was has quietly left it. The product is still there. The name is still on the box. But the thing that made it specifically itself has been optimized away, and the people who remember it know the difference, and the people who come after have no reference point for the loss. Children of the 1960s who ate TV dinners with the brownie in the corner and then grew up and encountered the tray, without it were experiencing, in miniature, the discovery that the world does not preserve the things you loved exactly as you love them. This is a lesson that arrives through many vehicles over a lifetime. The brownie compartment was simply one of the earlier ones, small enough to be almost funny, specific enough to be genuinely felt. You turned over the tray expecting the corner you remembered and found something else there, and for a moment the absence was larger than the object. The brownie was a small chocolate square in the corner of an aluminum tray. It was not a great brownie. It did not need to be. It needed only to be there, in its place, doing its job as the small good thing at the end of the meal. When it stopped being there, the meal was complete in every technical sense and missing something in every other sense. That is what the brownie was. That is what its absence meant. And that is why, 50 years later, the people who remember it still mention it first. It is the middle of the 1970s now, and something new has appeared on the kitchen counter. It is large and boxy, and it hums differently than the oven, and it promises to do in 4 minutes what the oven does in 25. The microwave oven arrived in American homes gradually through the 1970s, and it changed the TV dinner in ways that took a while to become fully visible. The aluminum tray, which had been the format of the TV dinner since the beginning, could not go in a microwave. This was a structural problem with no elegant solution. For a few years, brands offered both formats, the original for the oven and a new style for the microwave, and the two coexisted somewhat awkwardly. Then the microwave won, as it was always going to, and the aluminum tray began its long and graceful retirement. The microwave's arrival in American kitchens was not instantaneous. The first consumer microwave ovens appeared in the late 1960s and cost more than $1,000, which was a price that eliminated most of the households that had been most faithful to the TV dinner. Through the early and middle 1970s, the price came down steadily, and by the late 70s, a countertop microwave was within reach of a much broader market. By 1980, microwave ownership had crossed into the majority of American households, and the kitchen had been permanently rearranged around this new appliance and what it made possible. What the microwave made possible was speed on a different scale than anything the TV dinner had previously engaged with. 25 minutes had seemed fast in 1953, when the alternative was cooking from scratch. 4 minutes seemed not just fast, but almost implausible, a duration so short that it barely registered as waiting at all. You put the food in, you pressed a button, you turned around, and the food was done. The psychological experience of this was genuinely different from the oven ritual, and not entirely in the microwave's favor. The oven ritual had structure. The 4-minute microwave had a beep, and then it was over, and the abruptness of that took some getting used to. The frozen food industry adapted because it had no other option. The aluminum tray was replaced by plastic trays and cardboard containers that could withstand microwave energy without doing anything alarming. The compartment design survived the transition in modified form, which was a small comfort. The segmented plastic tray of the 1980s microwave dinner was a descendant of the aluminum tray, recognizably from the same family, with the same basic philosophy of each thing in its own space. But the material was different, and the heating process was different, and the result was different in ways that were difficult to specify precisely, but that anyone who had eaten both formats could detect without difficulty. The aluminum tray itself became a period object, a marker of a specific era of American domestic life, the way the console television and the rotary telephone were markers. When the last aluminum TV dinner trays disappeared from regular grocery store shelves in the early 1980s, they did not go with any announcement. They were simply replaced, the way all formats are eventually replaced by what comes after. And the replacement was more convenient and less everything else in ways that the convenience made it impolite to mention. What the microwave took from the TV dinner, along with the aluminum, was the ritual, the preheat, the 25 minutes, the oven mitt, the baking sheet, the careful transportation from oven to tray table, the additional 3 minutes of cooling that nobody observed but that everyone knew about. The ritual had been an inconvenience. It had also been a shape for the evening, a sequence of small actions that organized the time between deciding to eat and actually eating. The 4-minute microwave collapsed that sequence to almost nothing, and the evening, without the ritual to structure it, was slightly more formless than it had been. More convenient, more formless. These two things arrived together and have stayed together ever since. The TV dinner story, as most people know it, is a national story, a Swanson story, a story of standardized meals distributed from coast to coast in identical aluminum trays. But alongside that national story ran a quieter regional one, because there were local and regional brands selling their own versions of the frozen dinner in particular parts of the country. And those brands often produced meals that were specific to where they were sold. In the South, there were varieties of frozen fried chicken that bore a different relationship to the actual thing than what Swanson was offering. In parts of the Midwest, there were brands producing pork-heavy dishes that the national brands did not bother with. If you grew up eating one of these regional versions, you may have come to your first Swanson turkey dinner with a skepticism that was not entirely unfounded. The Southern regional frozen dinner market had a particular relationship with fried chicken that the national brands could not fully replicate from a factory in the Midwest. Southern fried chicken is a dish with strong regional opinions attached to it. Opinions about the seasoning and the coating, and the fat used for frying, and the particular color the skin should achieve. And those opinions were held with a conviction that made any approximation from outside the region feel like a comment on the region itself. The regional brands understood this and adjusted accordingly, producing a frozen fried chicken that spoke more specifically to the local palate, even if it still could not match what came out of a cast-iron skillet in an actual Southern kitchen. In the Northeast, regional brands produced dishes that reflected the particular eating habits of a more urban, more immigrant-influenced food culture. There were frozen dinner options that gestured toward Italian-American cooking, toward the casseroles and baked pastas that had become part of the American table through decades of immigration and adaptation. These were not Italian dishes. They were American dishes with Italian reference points, translated into the aluminum tray format with the same approximation that all TV dinner cooking involved, but pointing in a direction that the national brands rarely pointed. Texas had its own frozen food culture, as Texas tends to have its own version of most things. The beef was different. The seasoning leaned differently. The portions were larger in a way that felt less like a marketing decision and more like a cultural one. Because Texas, in the 1960s, had strong feelings about the appropriate size of a beef portion, and those feelings were not negotiable. A Texas-produced frozen beef dinner sat in its tray, with a confidence about the amount of meat that the Swanson Salisbury steak, however respectable, did not quite project. The regional brands also produced meals that have vanished more completely than even the national brands' discontinued products. Because regional brands left smaller paper trails and shorter production runs and fewer people who remember them specifically. There are people in certain parts of the country who ate a frozen dinner in the 1960s that no one outside their region ever encountered, a meal with a name that does not appear in any catalog of the era, made by a company that closed in the early 1970s and took its recipes with it. These meals exist now only in the specific food memories of the people who ate them, and those people are getting older, and when they are gone, the meals will be gone entirely, which is a kind of disappearance that has no remedy. What the regional freezer tells you, taken together with the national brands, is that the TV dinner in the 1960s was both a single story and many stories at once. The single story is the one about aluminum trays and Swanson and the democratization of convenience. The many stories are about the specific places and specific kitchens and specific regional palates that shaped what the frozen dinner looked like when it was made close to home. Both stories are true. Both deserve to be told. And the second one, the quieter one, is the one that is disappearing fastest. Step back from the aluminum tray for a moment and look at the whole picture. Because the TV dinner in the 1960s was not just a meal. It was a document. It told you things about what America was becoming, about what modern meant, about what progress was supposed to look like and taste like and cost. The TV dinner said that convenience was a virtue, that technology could be applied to the most intimate parts of daily life, and that this was good, that a meal produced by a factory in Omaha and frozen and shipped across the country and reheated in your oven could be dinner in the fullest sense of the word. Most of America agreed, at least on weeknights. And the fact that most of America agreed said something about the country that the food itself could not quite articulate on its own. The 1960s were a decade of enormous and competing energies. The space program was telling America that technology was the answer to every question worth asking. The civil rights movement was telling America that the answers it had given to certain questions were not answers at all and needed to be rethought from the foundation. The suburbs were telling America that the good life was a house with a yard and a car in the driveway and a television in the living room and a freezer full of options. These were not always compatible stories, and the decade was not always comfortable with the contradictions between them. The TV dinner lived in the middle of all of this and reflected it. It was a product of post-war industrial confidence, of the belief that manufacturing and distribution and refrigeration technology applied together could solve the problem of dinner the way other technologies were solving other problems. It was available to a wide range of households across an enormous country, which was a democratic fact even when other democratic facts were being contested loudly and painfully in the same years. It was designed primarily for the suburban household with a television, which meant it was implicated in the particular version of the American dream that was being built in those years. with all of that version's exclusions and limitations built into it alongside the convenience. The aluminum tray was also, without meaning to be, a document about labor, specifically about the labor of cooking and who performed it, and what it meant when a factory performed part of it instead. The lunch counter essay and the fast food story of the same era are both stories about how American eating was being reorganized around different relationships between food preparation and the people who ate the food. The TV dinner was part of that reorganization, the home-based part, the part that brought the logic of the factory into the kitchen and asked whether the kitchen needed to be what it had always been. America in the 1960s decided collectively and with considerable enthusiasm that the kitchen did not need to be what it had always been, that a meal from a factory was still a meal. That convenience was not a moral failing, but a reasonable response to the conditions of modern life. This decision had consequences that unfolded over decades in the quality of food and the loss of cooking knowledge and the industrialization of the American diet in ways that the 98-cent turkey dinner could not have predicted and did not intend. The tray was not trying to change everything. It was trying to solve Tuesday. But the solutions we choose for Tuesday tend to accumulate into something larger than any single evening. What the TV dinner said about America, in the end, is that America was a country willing to trade a certain kind of effort for a certain kind of ease, and willing to believe that the trade was fair. That willingness is still visible today, in every drive-thru and every food delivery app, and every meal kit, and every pre-portioned, pre-cooked, pre-seasoned product in every grocery store in the country. The aluminum tray was the beginning of that willingness being expressed at scale. It was small, and it cost less than $1, and it changed something. Let us end where the whole thing is going, which is to the question the title of this video has been quietly asking this whole time. What if we brought them back? Not the nostalgia of them, not a premium artisanal reimagining in a recyclable tray at $11.99. The actual thing, the 98-cent promise, the aluminum, the compartments, the brownie in the corner that nobody asked for and everybody needed. The 1960s TV dinner was many things, but what it was most fundamentally was a meal that made an honest, affordable, unpretentious agreement with the person eating it. It said, "Here is dinner. It is warm. It is yours. It will not take long." And it asked nothing back except 25 minutes and a working oven. There is an argument, a serious one, dressed in a foil tray, that we could use more of that right now. What we lost when the aluminum tray retired was not just a format. It was a philosophy. The philosophy of the TV dinner was that dinner should be complete, affordable, and uncomplicated, that a meal did not need to be an event or a statement or an opportunity for self-expression in order to qualify as dinner. The modern food landscape has largely abandoned this philosophy. The options in the frozen food aisle today are more numerous than anything the 1960s could have imagined, and they are better in many technical respects. And they are dramatically more expensive, and they require you to have opinions about things like grain sourcing and sodium content, and the distinction between natural flavors and artificial ones. The 1960s TV dinner required you to have an opinion about turkey or fried chicken. That was the decision. The rest was handled. The ritual is the other thing that deserves mourning, because the microwave did not just replace the oven. It replaced the waiting, and the waiting had value that nobody recognized until it was gone. 25 minutes between deciding on dinner and eating dinner was 25 minutes of anticipation, of the oven ticking toward done, of the smell building in the kitchen, of knowing what was coming without quite having it yet. Anticipation makes food taste better. This is not a sentimental observation. It is a physiological fact about how appetite and expectation interact. The 4-minute microwave removed the anticipation along with the inconvenience, and the food that came out of it, however hot, arrived before you were fully ready for it. The compartment is worth bringing back, too, and this may be the least sentimental argument of all three. The compartment told you what a portion was. It made the decision about how much protein and how much starch and how much vegetable without requiring you to negotiate with yourself at the stove. Modern nutritional thinking, which spends a great deal of effort on the question of portion and balance, has not produced a more elegant solution to this problem than the divided aluminum tray of 1962. The tray looked at the plate and said, "This much, arranged this way, and everything else is already decided." In an era of infinite food choice and infinite portion anxiety, that kind of decisive simplicity sounds almost radical. The brownie in the corner is the most important thing to bring back, and the reason is simple. The brownie said, "The meal is not just fuel. There is something at the end of this that is for no reason except that you deserve it." The small, unnecessary thing at the end of the meal is a form of generosity, a recognition that eating is not only a biological function, but also a human one, and human functions benefit from small moments of pleasure that serve no purpose beyond themselves. The modern frozen food aisle is very good at fuel and considerably worse at the brownie. It is optimized toward nutrition and away from the corner treat that costs a few extra cents and means more than the cents. What would it take to bring the 1960s TV dinner back in any meaningful sense is a question worth sitting with as the oven ticks toward done in whatever year you are reading this. It would take a willingness to accept the trade-offs that the tray accepted. Reasonable quality rather than perfect quality, familiar flavors rather than innovative ones, a modest price rather than a premium one, and a small chocolate thing in the corner that is drier than it should be, and completely correct anyway. It would take, in other words, the same agreement the tray made with the 1960s household, extended to whoever is sitting in the living room now with a tray table and a television, and the same basic need for dinner to be warm and complete and not require anything more than they have left to give on a Tuesday evening. That need has not changed. The tray understood it perfectly. It is still waiting to be rediscovered. It is a Saturday morning in 1964, and your mother is doing something that would have seemed extraordinary to her own mother a generation earlier. She is stocking the freezer, not preserving, not canning, not preparing for winter the way her grandmother would have understood preparation. She is sliding flat boxes into the freezer drawer with the efficiency of someone who has thought about this, who has planned the week from the freezer outward, who understands that the aluminum tray sitting in that cold drawer is not a backup plan, but a frontline strategy. The freezer in the 1960s American kitchen was not the auxiliary appliance it had once been. It had become, quietly and without ceremony, the most important thing in the room. The refrigerator had been the revolutionary appliance of the 1930s and 40s, the machine that changed how American households thought about food storage and freshness and the weekly shop. By the time the 1960s arrived, the refrigerator was no longer revolutionary. It was furniture. It was assumed. The freezer compartment at the top, which had been a novelty in earlier models, had in many households been upgraded to a separate chest freezer in the garage or basement, a second appliance devoted entirely to the cold storage of food that was not needed today, but would be needed eventually. The TV dinner made the freezer purposeful in a new way. Before the TV dinner, the home freezer held ice cream, maybe some frozen vegetables, possibly a cut of meat that had been bought in bulk. These were storage items, things waiting to become meals, rather than things that already were meals. The TV dinner changed the character of what lived in the freezer. Now the freezer held complete dinners. It held Tuesday and Wednesday and the emergency Thursday, when nothing had been planned and everyone was hungry, and the oven was the only thing standing between the family and a difficult evening. The stocking of the freezer became a form of household management that women of the era understood as planning, as care extended into the future. To have 4 TV dinners in the freezer was to have 4 evenings covered, 4 potential crises preempted, 4 moments in the coming week when the question of what is for dinner would answer itself without requiring anything from you beyond the act of having thought ahead. This is a form of domestic intelligence that does not get enough credit, the intelligence of the person who anticipates the week rather than reacting to it. The freezer also changed the relationship between the grocery shop and the meal. Before the TV dinner, the grocery shop and the meal were tightly linked. You bought what you were going to cook, usually within a few days of cooking it, and the freshness of the food was the measure of the quality of the meal. The TV dinner loosened this link considerably. You could shop once a week or twice a month, and the freezer absorbed the surplus and held it until it was needed. The meal was decoupled from the shop in a way that gave the household more flexibility than it had ever had before. The freezer became, in this sense, a form of time travel. You were shopping in the present for meals in the future, and the future could absorb a fairly wide range of contingencies. Rain on the day you planned to cook, a child homesick from school, a husband working late, a mother too tired by 5 in the afternoon to think about anything more complicated than setting the oven to 350 degrees. The freezer held the answer to all of these situations, stacked in bright boxes, waiting. That kind of readiness is its own form of comfort, and the households of the 1960s felt it and organized themselves around it, and the TV dinner made it possible. Let us talk about sound for a moment, because the 1960s kitchen had a particular acoustic quality that no modern kitchen has replicated, and that is worth describing before it fades entirely from living memory. The oven ticked. Not continuously, but at irregular intervals, the metal of the oven box expanding and contracting around the heat inside it. A sound like a clock that could not quite commit to a rhythm. The refrigerator cycled on and off with a hum that was so constant you stopped hearing it until it stopped, and then the silence where it had been was briefly noticeable before the hum started again. These were the background sounds of a kitchen at work, and they are gone now, replaced by different sounds that belong to different appliances and a different era. The oven tick was the sound of waiting, and waiting in the 1960s kitchen was an active state rather than a passive one. You were doing something while the oven worked. You were setting the tray tables in the living room, or pouring the drinks, or checking on the children, or simply standing at the kitchen counter with a cup of coffee, watching the clock and listening to the oven tick toward done. The tick was a kind of progress report from the appliance. It meant the metal was hot, and the heat was moving, and the tray inside was receiving it. It meant things were proceeding. In a decade when a great deal was not proceeding in any direction anyone felt certain about, the oven's reliable tick was a small reassurance. The sound the foil made when you peeled it back deserves its own mention, because it was specific in a way that is almost impossible to describe accurately. A soft metallic resistance followed by a release, followed by the hiss of steam that had been building under the foil for 25 minutes and was now escaping in a column that smelled of whatever was in the tray. The foil sound was the sound of the meal announcing itself, the moment between waiting and eating, the acoustic version of the tray being ready. If you had heard that sound 100 times in your childhood, and you almost certainly had, it lives in you somewhere below the level of conscious memory. A sound that close to food and warmth and the end of hunger does not leave cleanly. The fork on the aluminum tray was another sound unique to this era and this format. A fork on a ceramic plate makes one sound. A fork on an aluminum tray makes another. Lighter, slightly more metallic, with a small scrape when the tines caught the ridges of the compartment walls. Children eating TV dinners developed an unconscious technique for navigating the compartment ridges without making the scrape. Not because anyone told them to, but because the sound was a minor irritation that efficiency naturally avoided. This is the kind of small motor skill that a generation of children developed and then had no further use for when the aluminum tray retired and the microwave arrived, and the sound of dinner changed entirely. The television was the other sound in the room, and the television sound of the 1960s was different from any screen sound that came after it. The audio was narrower, concentrated in a smaller frequency range, with a particular warmth in the mid-range that modern high-definition audio has moved away from. Game show hosts sounded like game show hosts. Western soundtracks sounded like Western soundtracks. The laugh track on the sitcoms was its own specific artifact of the era, a sound that meant something was supposed to be funny and that became, through repetition, almost comfortable in its reliability. You ate your TV dinner to this sound. Your fork made its small aluminum sound. The oven had gone quiet now that it was off. The refrigerator cycled. Outside a car passed. The evening had its sounds, and they were the sounds of a particular time and a particular way of living that has not come back. It is Thursday morning, and your mother has a list. The list is written in her particular handwriting on a notepad she keeps in the kitchen drawer, and it is organized not by category, but by the route she takes through the grocery store, because she has done this enough times that the store is mapped in her memory and the list follows the map. Produce first, then the meat counter, then the middle aisles for the canned goods and the dry goods and the things that keep. And then, at the back of the store, the freezer cases, where the list ends and the decision-making begins. Because the frozen food section in 1964 is not yet large enough to require a list. You know what is there. You know what you want. You open the glass door, feel the cold air, and choose. The grocery trip in the 1960s was a weekly event with a particular social texture that the modern supermarket experience has largely dissolved. The store was smaller. The staff was more consistent. The woman behind the deli counter had been behind the deli counter for several years and knew your mother's preferences without being asked. The butcher wrapped the meat in white paper and wrote the price on it with a grease pencil and handed it across the counter with a brief exchange about the weather or the local school sports situation. These were not deep relationships. They were the shallow, consistent, reliable relationships of a neighborhood commerce that knew itself and the people it served. The frozen food section at the back of the store was where the list became flexible. You had planned for Tuesday night, and Tuesday night was going to be the Swanson fried chicken, because that was what was in the list. But you were also looking at the turkey dinner and thinking about Thursday, and the pot pies were on sale, which changed the calculation for Wednesday. The frozen food section was where the week got adjusted in real time, where the plan met the promotion and the plan usually yielded, because the promotion was real and the plan was only provisional anyway. The cart in the frozen food section filled with a particular sound, the flat boxes of TV dinners sliding against each other, stacked on their sides, the bright photographs of meals facing up toward the fluorescent lights of the store. You could look into your cart in the frozen food aisle and see the week ahead in a way that no other section of the store permitted. The produce told you about freshness and immediacy. The meat counter told you about tonight. The frozen food section told you about the whole structure of the coming days, about which evenings were planned, and which were contingencies, and which were the nights nobody wanted to cook, and the tray was the answer before the question was fully asked. Your mother paid at the checkout with cash, because the 1960s grocery store ran on cash with occasional checks, and the act of handing over bills for the week's food was a direct encounter with the cost of feeding a family that the modern credit card transaction has softened into abstraction. You felt the money leave. You counted the change. The TV dinners had their part in that arithmetic, their modest costs measured against the other things in the cart, and they came out well in the comparison, because they were cheap and complete and required nothing further from you once you got them home. The drive home was the last part of the ritual. The bags in the back seat, or the trunk, the frozen things staying cold in their boxes, during the 10 or 15 minutes between the store and the kitchen. You carried them in and put them in the freezer, the new boxes going in the back and the older ones coming forward, a rotation that your mother managed with the same unsentimental efficiency she applied to everything in the kitchen. The week was stocked. The freezer was full. Tuesday was handled. That was enough. And there it is, 30 chapters of aluminum and anticipation, of foil and frosted freezer doors, and the particular smell of a Tuesday evening when the oven was working and the tray tables were out, and nobody had to be anywhere for the next 25 minutes except right there in the living room, in front of the television, waiting for dinner to be done. We started with 260 tons of leftover turkey and a salesman with an idea and a 98-cent promise. We ended with the last tray in the trash and the memory of it still warm in your hands. In between, we spent time with the brownie in the corner and the foil that never peeled back quite right, and the oven that ticked and the fork that scraped against the aluminum ridges, and the particular quality of light in a 1960s living room when everyone was pointed in the same direction, and the meal was already handled, and the evening was simply itself. Nothing more complicated than that. If you lived through this era, you did not need us to tell you any of it. You already knew the weight of the tray. You already knew the sound. You already knew exactly which brand your mother bought and exactly which meal was worth negotiating over and exactly how the brownie tasted on the evenings, when everything else had been a little too much and the small chocolate square in the corner was the only thing that did not ask anything of you. You knew all of this. We just gave it a place to exist out loud for a little while. And if you came to this story from a different direction, if you are younger than the era or simply curious about it, we hope what came through was not just the food, but the feeling underneath the food, the feeling of a time when dinner could be simple without being shameful, when convenience was not a guilty pleasure, but a reasonable response to the conditions of an ordinary life, when a tray from the freezer and a folding table and a television program and the people you loved most constituted an evening that was, by any honest measure, enough. More than enough. Exactly enough. That kind of enough is harder to find now. Everything is optimized and elevated and offered at a price point that assumes you have opinions about it. The frozen food aisle has more options than the 1960s could have imagined, and fewer of the things that made the 1960s frozen food aisle what it was. The brownie is still gone. The aluminum tray is still retired. The oven ritual has been replaced by a 4-minute beep in a plastic container that nobody is going to remember in 60 years. With the specific and physical tenderness that people remember the Swanson tray. But the memory is still there, in the people who ate these dinners as children and still feel something when they smell sage, dressing in a warm oven. In the people who worked in the factories that made these trays and understood that they were making something that mattered to somebody's Tuesday. In the households where the tray tables still come out on the right kind of evening, when the weather is cold and the week has been long and somebody has made the right call and pulled something from the freezer and set the oven to 350 degrees, and the whole arrangement has taken care of itself, with the quiet efficiency of a thing that knows exactly what it is for. If tonight feels like a tray table kind of evening, we think you should trust that instinct. Set up the table. Turn on something good. Let the oven do its work. And when the timer goes off, move with purpose, because the tray is hot and patience officially ran out about 10 minutes ago. Before you go, if this kind of evening is your kind of evening, the subscribe button is right there, and it costs you nothing, and it means a great deal to us over here. We do this because we believe the ordinary things deserve to be told slowly and with care, and your being here is the reason we keep telling them. If you have a memory of a TV dinner, a specific tray, a specific meal, a specific evening in a specific room with specific people, we would genuinely love to read it in the comments. Those details are the history. They belong in the record. We are also on Spotify now. If you would rather carry this kind of storytelling with you on the commute or on a walk or on the kind of evening when you want something in your ears that is calm and warm and not trying to sell you anything except a little time in a decade that knew how to make Tuesday feel like enough. The link is in the description. Come find us there. It is late now. The television is low. The tray table is folded against the wall. The aluminum is in the trash where it belongs, having done its job with the modest and complete reliability that was always its best quality. The oven has gone quiet. The week is still ahead. We will see you in the next one.